Hi, this is Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek. Today I want to talk to you about John Piper, one of the most influential proponents of Calvinism of our day. Now, while I detest the teaching of Calvinism regarding predestination, that's not going to be the focus of this video. I want to cover what he says about prosperity. In this first clip, he quotes the Apostle Paul regarding those who seek to be rich.
So why do I abominate this so-called gospel? I think it is another gospel. And the first reason would be simply to go straight to the Bible and see what Paul says about those who want to be rich. I mean, it's just, he says, this is 1 Timothy 6:6, now there's great gain in godliness with contentment. In other words, without craving for stuff. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. If we have food and clothing, with these we'll be content. It's just amazing. But those who desire to be rich, now here's the key text, this is verse 9. Those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving, that is, this craving to be rich, that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs.
I agree with what Paul is saying there, that seeking wealth is a dangerous and potentially self-destructive thing. Jesus said to seek first the kingdom. The question is, if you seek first the kingdom, does that mean that you're committed to a life of poverty and that there's no room for a theology that includes financial prosperity? Let's consider Paul's statement about being content with food and raiment. Many people just quote that, apparently without any consideration for proper exegesis. Is Paul really saying that we should be content with nothing more than the clothes on our backs and enough food to survive? Do you know anybody who lives that way? I mean, Paul didn't even mention having a roof over your head. Are we all supposed to be sleeping on the sidewalk somewhere? Do any of these Calvinist and cessationist ministers live that way? No. Even the most humble, virtuous Christians don't live that way. You can't take Paul literally here any more than you can take Jesus literally when he said to hate your father and mother, or to cut off your hand, or to eat his flesh and drink his blood. This is the use of hyperbole, which is seen throughout the New Testament. Paul is making a point that we shouldn't be seeking riches. We should be seeking to please God. If Paul had been saying that we shouldn't need a house to be content, then why does the book of Acts end with Paul renting a house and entertaining guests? Peter had a house in Capernaum, and in the book of Acts, we see that the members of Cornelius' household found Peter when he was staying at the home of Simon the tanner in the city of Joppa. Now, Simon had a tanning business, not for suntans, but for tanning animal hides for leather goods. His house was right on the seashore in an area with plenty of sunshine, which was required for the tanning trade. So in effect, Peter was hanging out with a guy who had waterfront property. In his book Against Heresies, Irenaeus tells us that the Apostle John fled a bathhouse in Ephesus upon hearing the heretic Cerinthus had entered it. Bathhouses were essentially ancient spas where you could take a steam bath, get a massage, and just hang out with the locals, socializing and so forth. Now, if we're supposed to be content with food and raiment, what in the world was John the Beloved doing hanging out in a bathhouse? You see, a lot of our preconceived ideas about the apostles are based in religious tradition rather than on the facts. Certainly, they faced persecution and difficulties at times, but they also had times where they moved about freely and lived comfortably without guilt. But whether times were good or bad, their focus was on spreading the gospel and serving the Lord, as ours should be. The main thing that John Piper said that triggered me is this.
And Paul in Romans 8 said, even we who have the Holy Spirit groan inwardly as we wait for our adoption as children, the redemption of our bodies. So even those in this life who have the Holy Spirit will experience all the rheumatism and cancer and accident and horror that the world does. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all.
He does deliver him out of them all, but that's not talking about when we get to heaven. Many are the afflictions of the righteous is a quote from the 34th Psalm, verse 19. So let's talk about Psalm 34 to get a little more context. The psalm is entitled A Psalm of David when he pretended madness before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. David was a fugitive from Saul. After narrowly escaping from the Philistine city of Gath, he and his men went to the caves of Adullam near Bethlehem, and it was there that he is believed to have composed this psalm. Through all of his battles and all of the time fleeing the wrath of Saul, David escaped without so much as a broken bone. He mentions that in verse 20, which is also a prophetic reference to Jesus' crucifixion. The 34th Psalm is talking about the goodness of God toward the righteous in this life. It's not talking about how we have to go through life sick and broke until one day we get to heaven and everything will be better. David saw God come through for him time and time again because he placed his trust in God against the lion, the bear, Goliath, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Syrians, and of course Saul. So the afflictions David was referring to had nothing to do with sickness. David also wrote the 23rd Psalm that says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Well, we won't have any enemies when we get to heaven, so this is talking about God's bountiful provision for us here on earth. Now, if you go through life expecting sickness, poverty, and basically everything bad one can imagine, that's probably what you're going to get. But if you'll live righteously before God, you can stand on His word to receive healing and answers to prayer. Now, I realize that John Piper is an educated man. He has a doctorate in New Testament studies, and I respect that. And I'm not knocking theology. I love theology. But you can study Greek, Hebrew, Latin, the Old Testament, the New Testament, church history, and every other aspect of theology and still miss what the Bible is saying. That's why God has to turn to less educated people like fishermen or tax collectors from time to time in order to do the work of the ministry. The so-called prosperity preachers might not be as educated, but if they understand that God is with them and will come through for them as they walk uprightly before Him and put their trust in Him, they can experience victories that the religiously indoctrinated could never imagine. And in fact, that's what's happened over the past half century as the Spirit of God has been moving and impacting nations around the world that have set aside their religious traditions and sought the true and living God. The same God that prospered Abraham 4,000 years ago is prospering the work of people of faith today because He doesn't change. He's just as good today as He was back then. Thanks for watching.